Hi, everyone. We're back. What we want to do for our next session is do something we're calling lightning rounds. As we look past the election and really into 2021, there's a number of topics in youth justice that are likely to come up over the next 11 to 12 months that are worth writing about, they're worth reporting about, and they're obviously worth signaling to you um, some of the key points that you should be looking at. Each one of those topics would take a whole panel, of course, but what we're trying to do is give you at least a 10-minute taste for each of our five speakers, and then we'll open it up for questions for each one of them. And we'll be going till about 3:30 or so. And obviously, we won't cover everything. So I hope our speakers will indulge us and give us a quick lightning round. They have some slides as well they want to show you. But I want to start, first of all, with MaryAnn Scali. And really, the place we're starting at is where she's starting at, which is the court system, which is where all the problems, if we're talking about youth justice, really begins. So let me bring up MaryAnn Scali. I see she's there. MaryAnn is the executive director of the National Juvenile Defender Center. Welcome to our webinar series, MaryAnn.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks all for being here today. I know that really everyone just wants to keep checking what the state updates and ballots look like today, but really appreciate your attention on these issues, especially because all of us have seen such important reporting about what's happening in the adult criminal justice system. We just don't see the same kind of coverage in the youth court system. And so I'm really grateful to have this opportunity, Steve, to be here with everybody today. I do have some slides and would love for those to get brought up. And as they're being brought up, I'll just give a little introduction to this session. All right. So in the last session, Ann Teagan talked about reforms that have happened. And she also previewed for us some potential reforms in the years ahead. And I'm sure this point's been made by other speakers across this series. But what doesn't get talked about nearly often enough in reporting are the harms that youth face in the juvenile court system. And as a defense attorney and a defender, what we could benefit from more than anything else is reporting on these critical harms and civil rights violations that are occurring every day in youth courts. The United States treats children, especially children of color, differently than any nation in the world. We incarcerate children at the highest rate in the world. I know you've had speakers talk about that. We shackle children with belly chains, leg irons, handcuffs in states across the nation. Though we've had 33 states create reforms on shackling, we still have many more to do. And we've been recently in states where we see all children brought in shackles into court who come from detention. We still use solitary confinement, and we still strip search children. So these are just some examples of ways in which your reporting could really shine a light on what's happening in the court system. But I want to lay out for you some issues that our other panelists are going to talk about today. So if we could look at the next slide and put them in the context of civil rights. So civil rights violations occur when there's a constitutional harm that's occurring in a system. And it's occurring with a state actor, either an individual or a municipality, and we can prove that that harm is ongoing. And as many speakers have already talked about, the pervasive racial and ethnic disparities across the juvenile court system have to change. We have to be able to impact policies and procedures that allow for these disparities to occur. And what I hope you come away from today is encouragement to talk to juvenile defenders in every place where you're reporting, because they can tell you what's happening in terms of issues that impact children on the streets and in courtrooms every single day. Precursory stops. So just looking at a young person, and because they don't like where they are, what they're wearing, a law enforcement officer stops them and questions them and brings them in. So racial and ethnic disparities are critical, and one of our speakers is going to focus on those. Girls. We still see this system that's supposed to be focused on rehabilitation and justice, bringing in girls that's supposed to, in this idea of protection. And what we're doing is we're actually depriving them of liberty in this notion of good. And we know that there is a much greater likelihood of harm occurring to young girls, to all girls, when they're brought into the court system than if we treat them in the community. And then youth tried in adult court. That itself is a due process issue. Why do we allow in this nation for young people under the age of 18 to be tried in adult court? So our other speaker will speak about youth and adult court system. And then finally, researcher Gina Vincent's going to talk with us about risk assessment instruments and how they are often in places applied unequally when there isn't effective implementation. And what I hope you'll see through this quick presentation is that juvenile defense attorneys can really impact all of these issues. If young people have the kind of lawyer you would want if it were your child in the system, we would be able to combat racial disparities, we'd be able to push against a system that brings in girls unnecessarily. We would have more young people actually treated in the youth system, and we would ensure that as instruments of risk are used, they're only used as they should be. And what we see by and large across the country are systems of juvenile defense that are inadequate, that are not the kinds of systems you would want for your child, that are defense attorneys who are given too many cases, who are underpaid, who aren't paid to actually represent a young person before a hearing or after the disposition. All right, let's look at the next slide and dig in a little bit to what our defense attorneys are seeing. So in addition to those issues you're going to hear about from the other speakers, when we did a survey to 250 juvenile defenders across the country, and we asked them what the predominant civil rights abuses are that they see among their clients in juvenile court, this is how they responded. So remember, these are defenders across the entire nation. So 81% said they see clients who are racially targeted for stop, frisk, and arrest. So based on just a young person's skin color, that they see pervasive in actually interaction with law enforcement that shouldn't occur and that doesn't occur with white youth. Racially disparate treatment for commitment and detention. So I know that you saw those data and statistics in earlier presentations and how disparate the decisions are about young people, Black, Brown, Native children especially, when it comes to decisions to detain them and to commit them. And we know that across the country that we need stronger advocacy and more reporting on those disparities. Use of force by police, 71% saw that there was inappropriate use of force by police occurring with young people. And we don't see those stories a lot of times because we're trying to protect the confidentiality of young people. But we'll talk later in just a few minutes about what I hope that reporters could do to actually learn about those instances. Use of force by facility staff. I'm wondering if any of you could just note in the chat, how many of you heard the story of Cornelius Frederick in May from Michigan? A young 16-year-old boy was being held in a facility and through a physical restraint died. These instances occur in placements all across the country. We did have some reporting this year that looked at harmful conditions and treatments in facilities and saw some private facilities shut down. And in fact, the facility Cornelius Frederick was in was shut down. A number of years ago, we heard about the Fight Club in Florida. Again, pervasive mistreatment of young people in the hands of the state. So if this system is actually intended to rehabilitate young people, we have to have much greater public awareness about these harms that are occurring every day. Harmful conditions of confinement. So things like solitary confinement and strip searching and crowding and inappropriate, physical care is occurring still today in facilities. Also, we see young people who are obstructed from being able to engage with their attorneys. And it's a basic fundamental due process right for youth to be able to talk to their attorney, to have conversations about what's happening in the case. And the fact that when we did this survey across the country, close to 40% of attorneys talked about how they were obstructed from engaging. And then tasing, this incredibly harmful practice occurring. Okay, next slide. So let's dig in a little bit to what we hope attorneys could report on. So this is a website, a toolkit that we've put together with the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Initiative called defendracialjustice.org. And what you'll see in there is a range of information, tools, research, bibliographies that we hope reporters like you will access and dig into stories about all the issues that we're seeing. What you won't be able to get to are the motions and pleadings that we're building for defenders to be using, but we hope you engage with them across the country. Next slide. And what you're going to see here is this is our network of attorneys across the country. So wherever you are, we can connect you to a juvenile defender to really dig into stories. Let's go to the next slide. And here are some of the things that we hope that you can dig into. So Anne talked about youth at interrogation. What are ways reporters can help make that happen to make sure that young people's voices are protected? I hope many of you saw When They See Us, Anna DuVernay's piece that came out last year, and the harmful practices and tactics that happen to youth at interrogation. You can talk with defenders about data on the number of youth who have lawyers at interrogation in their absence, and tell the stories of policing practices of what's happening to children during interrogation. Second, use of force against children. So those stories aren't being told. You can connect to your local juvenile defenders. You can ask them what's happening with use of force and expose use of force against young people and help change those practices. Stop and frisk, what we talked about earlier. Again, asking defenders about how often their clients are stopped for pretextual, meaning no reason, just stopped because, and gathering data and reports on what's happening. And removing police from school. So I know that story was told. So we hope that these are some of the issues that you can dig into and look at. Any questions? The next slide is just contact information, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, MaryAnn. We will hold the questions until after everybody speaks. So let me go direct to Jeannette Pai-Espinosa, who's the president of the National Crittenton Foundation. She's also director of the OJJDP National Girls Initiative, and she's going to be talking about girls and justice, which is one of the direct things that MaryAnn left us with. So Jeannette, over to you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Before I start, I just want to make clear that in talking about girls, we're not positioning girls against boys or trying to compare the experiences. We really are just looking at better ways to ensure that girls and their families have the supports and services that they need in order to prevent girls from ending up in the juvenile justice system, and if they are in the justice system, to receive a treatment and support that's fair and that actually provides a positive influence in their lives. One of the things that we see from girls who end up in the juvenile justice system, and I could take the first slide now, please, is that before girls actually hit the system, the juvenile justice system, they have a very high level of exposure to other systems. And by other systems, I'm talking about schools, child welfare, housing. They have a high level of exposure to multiple systems before they get to the juvenile justice system. And let me add also, as you can see from the slide, that girls of color are twice as likely to be confined or detained as white girls. So the racial disproportionality that MaryAnn mentioned is very much present for girls, just as it is for boys. You can see here that girls may experience housing instability. They may have issues at school. Their families may be involved in child welfare, family support, or abuse and neglect cases, all in many instances before they hit the juvenile justice system. So they faced a fair level of adversity and system involvement before they get to the system. Next slide, please. One of the things that distinguishes girls is that the number of girls relative to the total number of youth in the juvenile justice system is small. It is small, and additionally, a very small percentage of those girls commit acts that pose any risk to public safety. And you can see the general numbers from 2017 here on this slide, go all the way down to the bottom to see that 4% of arrests were in the violent crimes index. We often get asked the question, are girls getting more violent? Or what's going on there? Why are they ending up in the system? And when we talk about drivers of girls into the system, we'll hit on that a little bit. I think one of the things that I want to bring up here that's not called out here, though it's hidden sort of in the categories of offense, is that girls are often detained for status offenses. If you're not familiar with status offenses, are acts that are considered a law violation simply because of the age of the young person. These are things like truancy, running away, ungovernability, curfew violations, tobacco and alcohol possession and use. So they are acts that if you were an adult would not be considered criminal. High percentage of girls are sort of pushed into the system because they're detained by status offenses. And that has a lot to do with sort of their social environment and what's pushing them into the system, which I'll talk about in a second. Next slide. So looking at drivers of girls into the system, and I'm going to go through these really quickly, and I'm going to be really brief because I'm hoping we can get into some dialogue after my co-presenters present. There are clear patterns for girls when you look at the numbers and the systems that are pushing them into the system. So school push out is perhaps the number one of a couple. So exclusionary discipline. So you see racial disparities, and you see girls who are in schools that get cited for dress code violations, and You see this sort of rolling cumulative effect of interactions with school, and certainly the presence of school resource officers exacerbates that, because we see girls getting arrested or detained in schools for violations that, if there were no school resource officers, could be handled through mediation or restorative justice procedures. So girls are getting pushed into the system in very high numbers through school disciplinary actions. Intersectional disparities, I'll just talk about one here. Very high percentage of youth that are in the juvenile justice system are LGBTQ. They are getting pushed out both of schools and of families and ending up in the justice system for a variety of reasons. Health risks and needs. Talk about this a little bit more specifically when I get into adverse childhood experiences, but you see girls who are coming from homes where there's substance use disorders in the home. They may have them. They're certainly present in the homes. You have people with diagnosable mental health issues, as well as physical health issues. And then you have a fair number of girls who have disabilities that go unrecognized, that ends up creating situations that push them into the system. Family violence and conflict. A lot of what goes on in the family. Some of you may be familiar with the Domestic Violence Act that several years ago instituted a mandatory and pro-arrest policy and practice position around domestic violence situations that either required or offered as a preferential response, detaining someone from the home when domestic violence or family violence had been issued. We caught through our juvenile justice work about 4 years ago, patterns where girls were being detained in those family violence situations, where the family violence was between siblings, or siblings and a girl, or girl and a parent, where girls ended up being the ones that were being detained and arrested and pushed into the system. And the last, but perhaps certainly not the least, is girls face a high level of exposure to adversity and trauma. And I would add into this category sexual exploitation and trafficking. You probably have heard that there's been a lot of coverage about trafficking and looking at the root causes of that, and how girls end up getting pushed into the system, out of homes and into the system, because of exposure to that. We're going to see that really concretely in a second. I can take the next slide. So if you are not familiar with adverse childhood experiences, I encourage you to look into it. It is a body of science that has a tremendous amount of data behind it, and it is 10 categories of childhood adversity that young folks face. And these are the categories across the bottom. They include abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And when you look at boys and girls and you think about the drivers of girls into the system, it becomes pretty clear that there's incredible exposure to sexual abuse, to physical abuse, emotional neglect on the part of girls who are in the juvenile justice system. So this is data from, I believe, 2014 of youth that are in the juvenile justice system. And you can see, particularly for sexual abuse, how high the numbers are for girls, and also for physical abuse. And in different studies, we've seen a bigger differentiation, higher levels of abuse for girls in the emotional neglect category. And one of the things I say to folks when they ask, why girls run away so much, I think you have to ask yourself, what are they running away from, and what are they running to? I think if you look at sexual abuse and then factor in high levels of emotional neglect, it becomes very clear. So what do we need to do about this? A little bit, this is what I'm going to say is consistent with what MaryAnn said, and I know will be consistent with the presenters to come, and that is we really need to create a system, a community-based, preferably, system of supports and services that allow young women, girls, and their families to heal, to address the root causes, and to be healed, and to not be locked up where they will be further traumatized. Girls are often further traumatized and penalized for their responses to the abuse they face. Running away, again, is a good example of how girls get pushed into the system. Community-based services early on, and gender-responsive supports and services that are trauma-informed. So it really ought to become a sort of a web or an ecosystem of supports for girls and families, for those girls who really pose no risk to public safety. And with that, I'm going to close and look forward to questions.
Thank you for keeping within the time frame, and a reminder that we will post the slide presentation on our conference page.
Wonderful.
Take a closer look at it. And again, also, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. Specify which speaker you'd like to respond, or all of them, as the case may be, and we will get to them as soon as the first round ends. So I'd like to now move to Andrea McChristian. Andrea is the Law and Policy Director of the New Jersey Institute for Social Scientists. Social Science, I'm sorry. Andrea, over to you.
Hi, good
Andrea.
afternoon. Okay, can you see me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. And as forewarning, I will not be showing slides, but I will be speaking about racial disparities in youth commitments. And in doing so, I want to start with a story that I think sets the frame, the story of the Bordentown School. Founded in 1886 by the formerly enslaved Reverend Walter Rice, the Bordentown School was located in Bordentown, New Jersey, and was an elite state-run boarding school for New Jersey's Black youth. Called the Tuskegee of the North after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, the school educated generations of New Jersey's Black youth and was visited by such luminaries as Eleanor Roosevelt, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington, just to name a few. After the legal end of school segregation, the school attempted to integrate, but ended up closing in 1955. And now, over 60 years after the Bordentown School's closure, what sits on the land that was once home to the Tuskegee of the North? Hayes, New Jersey's only girls' youth prison. And across the street sits JMSF, the state's most secure youth prison for boys. Bordentown has become the school-to-prison pipeline realized in New Jersey. And I'd like to start with the story of Bordentown because I think it speaks to the investments that New Jersey has made in our young people, particularly our young Black people, in this powerful moment where so many are taking to the streets across our state and nationwide to proclaim that Black lives matter. So I'd like to first outline the deep ends of the system, our state's youth prisons, before scrolling back to how racial disparities at the front end of the system have led to our state's 3 youth prisons being full of mostly Black youth. To start on a positive note, New Jersey's done an excellent job of decreasing its numbers of incarcerated youth, influenced by such initiatives as the JDAI program aimed to decrease the number of young people in juvenile detention facilities. As of June 1st of this year, New Jersey has 141 incarcerated young people, so less than 200 youth are incarcerated in the Garden State. So given these low numbers, why would I still say that New Jersey's youth prison model is a failed experiment? First, New Jersey has the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the country. We are number 1. In New Jersey, a Black child is 21 times more likely to be detained or committed than a white child. And this Black to white disparity rate also tracks into the adult incarceration population as well. And this is so despite research from the Sentencing Project, from the CDC, and others that show that for most offenses, Black and white youth commit them at similar rates, and that any differences in offenses committed can't explain the extreme racial disparities we see at the deep end of the system. In our state of almost 9 million people, only 19 white kids are incarcerated as of June 1st, 2020. By stark contrast, 91 of New Jersey's 141 locked up youth are Black. Second point I want to make is that New Jersey's youth prisons are not rehabilitative. Of the 336 young people released from New Jersey's juvenile facilities in 2015, over 1/4, 28%, ended up right back within these facilities within 3 years. Third, the state is spending exorbitant amounts of money on non-rehabilitative youth prisons, which are largely empty. This year, in the midst of an international pandemic, the state will spend $300,000 to incarcerate each young person in a state youth prison, a more than $58,000 increase over 2018. This substantial investment in youth incarceration is increasing even as the number of incarcerated youth is on the decline, going from an average daily population of 215 kids in 2018 to 186 in 2020. Because what's happening is that New Jersey is decreasing its numbers of incarcerated youth, which is amazing, even though we have those stark and extreme racial disparities, but isn't right-sizing and transforming its system. Thus, we're operating 3 youth prisons, which have a capacity of 511 young people, in a way that they're over half empty. In fact, the Johnstone campus, which includes both JMSF and Hayes, which were formerly the Boarding Town School, is almost 2/3 empty. So for all these reasons and more, the Institute, my organization, and our partners launched the 150 Years is Enough campaign in 2017, named for the then age of New Jersey's oldest youth prison, Jamesburg, which still stands. Through our campaign, we seek to close New Jersey's 3 youth prisons and develop well-funded and resourced community-based continuums of care in the communities most impacted by youth incarceration. Such a continuum would include funding for front-end prevention, diversion, intervention resources, and in the case where a young person needs to be out of home for public safety reasons and cannot be safely rehabilitated in a community, community-based placements that provide meaningful rehabilitation. But in looking at developing such a continuum, we have to analyze the myriad factors that push Black youth into our state's youth prisons. As the Institute for Social Justice outlined in our first report in our Youth Justice series, Bring Our Children Home, Ain't I a Child?, racial disparities are present in almost every touch point of the youth justice system. For one, a 2013 through 2015 report by the New Jersey Supreme Court Committee on Minority Concerns concluded that Black youth are, quote, consistently and disproportionately overrepresented through the juvenile justice decision-making continuum, end quote, are disproportionately represented in detention and correctional facilities, and are less likely to be diverted than their white counterparts. Put simply, this means that Black kids are disproportionately arrested, are not getting diverted, and as a result are being incarcerated in lopsided numbers. In addition, available efforts to divert young people from the system are not being equally employed, further exacerbating racial disparities and inequities. For example, let's turn to the Station House Adjustments Program. Per New Jersey Attorney General directive, all law enforcement agencies in New Jersey are required to use what are called station house adjustments, a process in which law enforcement diverts a young person who has committed a minor offense by offering them the opportunity to do community service, write a letter of apology, or complete some other condition rather than having a formal complaint filed against them. While all law enforcement agencies should be using this diversionary mechanism, over 60% of agencies that reported their station house adjustments data in 2015 reported that they hadn't completed a single one. This is only one example of how failure to meaningfully increase accountability for our front-end programs and services leads to the racial injustices we see in the deep end of our youth prison systems. So our position at the Institute is that New Jersey needs to commit to making meaningful investments in building up our kids rather than in prisons to incarcerate them to make Black Lives Matter. And while I focus my remarks on the state of New Jersey because that's where I work, that's where the Institute is based, and that's where we see these horrible, horrible racial disparities, these are also issues of racial disparities and youth commitment that can be seen across the entire nation and applied as well in other jurisdictions. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andrea. That was great. You just kept, again, within the time. I welcome that and appreciate that. Our next speaker, hold your questions for each speaker at the end, and we'll do a round of questions for each of them or for all of them. Lyle Chester is the director of the Emerging Adult Justice Project at the Columbia University Justice Lab. You may remember we had a speaker from the Justice Lab last week, Vinny Schiraldi, who is the co-founder and director of it. Lyle, welcome.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my work at the Justice Lab focuses on emerging adults, so it's youth ages 18 to 25, who are transitioning from adolescence to adulthood while involved in the justice system. When the first juvenile court was established in the United States over a century ago, there was a general understanding that youth are not adults and that they should not be in the adult criminal justice system. The first juvenile court was established in Cook County, Illinois, and soon after, every state followed suit and created their own separate juvenile justice system. The age range in which states chose to serve youth, especially the older age range, varied. Generally speaking, states have chosen the cutoff date of 16th birthday, 17th, or 18th birthdays. And over the past decade, there's been a trend in the US to move that upper age of jurisdiction up to 18. I think there are only 3 states now remaining with a jurisdiction that's set lower than the 18th birthday. Wisconsin, Texas, and Georgia are holdouts. This does not mean that youth under 18 can't be tried and sentenced as adults. You've heard that from prior speakers. Every state has some kind of provision, whether it's special transfer provision, automatic statutory exclusion, some way to get youth under 18 into the adult system and sentenced as an adult. But what it does mean is that for every state, when you turn 18 on that birthday, you are automatically tried and sentenced as an adult. There's no other way around it. Well, we have now entered a new phase of juvenile justice reform that questions this tradition. Why 18? Does this make sense? This movement is being driven by a number of factors. First, emerging adults are doing particularly poorly in the criminal justice system. They are, in fact, the drivers of mass incarceration. There's a disproportionate number of emerging adults who are arrested and admitted to prisons. They have by far the worst recidivism rates of any age group, and they have, shockingly, the highest racial disparities. Black males ages 18 and 19 are almost 12 times more likely than their white peers to be incarcerated. So although the racial disparities are stark and incredibly troubling for under 18, it actually is even higher for 18 and 19-year-olds and for emerging adults up to 24. Second reason that sort of people are questioning the jurisdictional limits of this separate youth justice system is the body of research in neurobiology and developmental psychology that indicate that 18, in fact, is not a magic birthday, and that we don't magically become fully mature, that our brains are developing until their mid-20s. It takes time to reach that adulthood, and that these emerging adults share many of the similar characteristics of their younger peers of adolescence that are particularly relevant to the justice system, right? They are influenced by peers. They are impulsive. They focus on the present and fail to take into consideration future consequences. They are, in fact, risk takers. And as a parent of now 2 emerging adults and 1 teenager, I cannot tell you how many times I have yelled, "What were you thinking?" Right? You are a bright, able person, but they're thinking with a teenage brain, right? And these characteristics are exacerbated with a history of trauma or brain injury. And so again, thinking about the earlier speakers, right? ACEs, having these adverse events in your life and traumatic events, then you're going to exacerbate all these characteristics in this time period. Third reason for driving this issue of jurisdiction is research in sociology and life course criminology, that it shows that when you achieve certain developmental milestones like marriage, like meaningful employment, things associated with adulthood, that's when desistance occurs. That's when you leave crime behind you. This generation is reaching those developmental milestones later than prior generations for a number of important reasons, but that the vast majority of youth will age out of crime by 25 if given the opportunity to do so. Ironically, the concern is that the justice system is actually preventing and interfering with this natural maturation process. The criminal justice system is harsh, has a number of severe collateral consequences that young people can't overcome, right? It's hard to get a job when you have an adult conviction. It's hard to obtain safe and secure housing. It's hard to get an education. Things like Pell Grants, tuition reimbursement, you're not eligible when you're in the adult system. So the question arises, would it be better to include some of the emerging adults, say up to age 21, in the juvenile system? And this is what some states are beginning to think about. And why are they thinking about it? Well, why would it make sense for a state? Juvenile system already serves adolescents. They supposedly should have both experience and expertise in adolescent development. A lot of states have recently raised the age to 18. They've already gone through this process. And despite some very dire predictions that this would completely overwhelm the youth justice system to bring in, let's say, 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, we now know that those predictions did not come to pass. And in fact, for many states, they've seen this extraordinary drop in their juvenile caseloads, despite the fact they just added a whole cohort of older youth into their caseloads. So I was looking at Massachusetts numbers this week, for example. Massachusetts raised the age from the 17th to the 18th birthday in 2013. And since then, that cadre of youth that now includes 17-year-olds have had a 46% drop in arrests. They've had a 24% decrease in delinquency cases, court cases, and a 36% decline in commitments, which are like sentences to youth corrections. The juvenile system is also individualized, is rehabilitative at its best. You know, you've heard, right? Speakers, we're not at our best, but that is in fact the goal, unlike the adult system. And emerging adults are really in this tremendous period of opportunity where they're very, very malleable. And so great experience, pro-social settings are going to put them on one path. The trauma of the adult justice system is going to put them on another track. And the difference between a juvenile adjudication, when you're found to have committed an offense beyond a reasonable doubt, in the juvenile side, that word adjudication versus the word on the adult side, conviction, has a lot of meaning and really can reduce some of the collateral consequences that happen to young people. So the theory here for states is that, well, if we include them in the juvenile system, we're going to provide more developmentally appropriate responses, we're going to have better youth outcomes, and we're going to increase public safety. So there's one state that has gone beyond debating this issue. They have plowed ahead, and they're the first in the country, and that is Vermont. In 2018, Vermont passed a law to raise the age to the 20th birthday, historic, first again in the country, and they've done it gradually. So the first cohort of 18-year-olds starting July 1, this last July 2020, if you committed an offense, it's not what they call the Big 12, which are the most serious offenses, you are going into what they have family court, which is their juvenile court, and you're going to be served by the Department for Children and Families, not the Department of Corrections, not the adult system. There are other bills have been filed in states. We have Connecticut, Colorado, California, Illinois. Massachusetts has actually have live legislation. We'll see what happens. There's 2 more weeks to see if that bill will pass. And we expect more states to join the fray in 2021. Washington State recently released a report looking at the health impact. Would there be a positive health impact if you raise the age to the 20th birthday? The department said, yes, there would be. And New York State, the leading advocates have called for raising the age as well above the 18th birthday. So looks like 21, right, is becoming the new 18. And I think this will be increasingly in the news, or should be increasingly in the news. Other aspects of this is you see a slew of litigation. You know, the Supreme Court said it is unconstitutional to execute a youth who committed a crime under 18. What makes 18 magical, right? So we have pending legislation attacking that and saying, no, someone is 18 and a half, 19 and a half, 19, there should be a constitutional significance. They should not be allowed to be executed. Same thing with life without parole sentences. There's a flurry of interesting reports around juvenile life without parole. The U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in. But again, there's litigation saying, does that make sense when you were, 1 day over 18? And then the last thing I'll just say, because I think I'm probably over or getting over, is just that I predict raise the age to spread. I think starting in 2021, we'll have 1 major or 2 major states, and I think it will be like a domino effect. And I think it will tip the other states. And I will stop, and thank you.
Thank you, Lael. So all of you will have an opportunity in the second round to elaborate as you answer some of the questions. But the final word in this round goes to Gina Vincent. Gina is Associate Professor at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She's going to tell us a little bit about what we know about the predictors of adolescent behavior and how that would impact policy and practice. And Gina has a slide presentation for us as well. So welcome, Gina.
Thank you, Stephen. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. Hi, everybody. So thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. And I am going to be reiterating much of what the other panelists have said. so you'll be getting a lot of repetition, and that is great. And I'm going to try to bring it all together a little bit here. So we're talking about adolescent behavior and what the contributions of risk assessment are. I also want to mention, I'm going to preface this by saying that risk assessment has come under a lot of scrutiny lately because of concerns about it being racially biased. And so that's a piece that I want to address as well. And as MaryAnn said in her first session, I'll be talking a bit about the importance of equal use and equal implementation of these across the system. So I'm going to make a few points. I've only got a few words on my slides. I have two main points that I want to make. First of all, most youth who do something delinquent or engage in delinquent behavior are low risk for reoffending and unlikely to ever be seen again by the juvenile justice system. Risk assessment instruments can help us differentiate who needs more attention from the vast majority of youth who don't need any attention, much of any attention. The second point I'm going to make is that recent concerns about these instruments being racially biased or even racist algorithms, as they've been called, are well-intentioned, but many of these concerns have gone well beyond the evidence and the science. And so I want to talk just a bit about that, and I have 2 points to cover there. And we'll end with some conclusions about where do we go from here. So this has been stated by several other presenters, but most youth by definition are low risk and they do not ever come back to the system. They're low risk to reoffend. So this is a picture from a large study that was done in North Carolina where they looked at all the youth that came into their system in 1 year who had been rearrested and referred to the court. 66% of those youth hadn't done anything really serious. They didn't necessarily have many or any priors, and these youth were diverted and they never came back. And the sentiment was that we're going to do our best job by diverting all of these youth away from the system and not intervening. As Leah was just saying, we could be doing more damage than good if we keep them in the system. We also know, again, as Leah just mentioned, that delinquent behavior is not uncommon during adolescence. In fact, studies have indicated that up to 60%, especially of males, have had at least one police contact in their life or have been arrested as a juvenile, as an adolescent. Not uncommon behavior at all. There's multiple studies across multiple countries that have documented what are the characteristics that are most likely to be related to those who continue to offend and continue to engage in behavior that is going to get them in trouble with the law, maybe even be violent, versus all of those youth, the vast majority of youth who, if they aren't low risk and they do come back, they're still likely to desist by young adulthood, just as Leal said. And those youth, we want to know how to intervene with, to help them, but keep that as a minimum, just to make sure that, just to hopefully help them on the right track sooner. As I mentioned, there is a number of studies that have documented what are the characteristics that are most likely to be, that are associated with youth who are most likely to continue in the system versus the vast majority of youth who aren't. These are the characteristics that have been documented, again, across many studies. And these have been distilled into what we call these risk assessment instruments, which are used widely in the juvenile justice system now. They're also used in the adult system, although I think the juvenile system's instruments are considerably better, to be frank. And they have taken all of this science and put it into practice by training probation officers, forensic evaluators, and others, how to use these instruments to assess youth, to determine who needs the most attention, which youth may need the most attention, and what can we do to intervene effectively in order to help them be more productive, responsible members of society sooner, right? Most of them just need a few services in order to help them do that, and this helps guide those decisions. The advantages of these instruments, if they are implemented well, and they are being used in the majority of states right now on a routine basis, the advantages is that they are more accurate and objective in their ability to categorize youth who need the most attention because they may be most likely to go out and do something serious, and separate them from the youth who we don't need much attention. They're more accurate and objective in their ability to do that than our unstructured hunches by decision makers, which can be very susceptible to a lot of different biases without being aware of that. There is also a lot of meta-analytic evidence indicating that when we utilize these tools properly and they're implemented well and they're paired with evidence-based practice, they are reducing rates of incarceration. So a previous speaker was talking about the concerns about commitment, especially among youth of color and disparities. These tools across the board, when implemented properly, have been reducing rates of incarceration. There is no good evidence to date. There's been no good scientific evidence to date that they're doing that at any different rate for youth of color or for white youth. What they seem to be doing is they're just decreasing incarceration across the board, but they're not necessarily eliminating racial disparities. Everyone's sort of getting committed at a lower rate when these tools are being used properly. Despite the positives of these use of these instruments, a lot of stuff has come out from the media over the last few years around these tools being biased. This is one that people might be familiar with. It came out from ProPublica, and they actually said that these are machine bias. There's software used around the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against blacks. They concluded that black defendants were still 77% more likely to be pegged as at a higher risk on this instrument that they were referring to. They were 77% more likely to be pegged as higher risk when they were only 45% more likely to actually commit a future crime relative to whites. That was their conclusion. They shine a light on a very important issue, which is the need for us to make sure that whatever practices we're putting in place in the system is not exacerbating the racial disparity that already exists. The intention of these risk assessment instruments was actually initially to make these decisions more objective and help to eliminate or reduce the racial disparities. So they shine a light on this issue. This research put a light on this issue that we all need to be very aware of and cognizant of and make sure that we are not doing this. On the other hand, the problem with this was that this study was very misleading. Their conclusions were very misleading. They did not use appropriate, scientifically accepted methods by our ethical standards for how we assess whether racial bias exists in an instrument. I won't get into the reasons, but I will say that recent research, 2 studies recently came out discrediting this study when they applied the correct procedures. There's a whole website devoted to racial, mapping pretrial injustice that refers to risk assessment tools as RATs to indicate that they are essentially causing racial disparities in our system. Again, I want to help interpret what all of this means because these statements have gone well beyond the evidence of what we know. The notion that racial and ethnic disparities exist in our justice system is indisputable. I'm absolutely not disputing that. That is very clear. I don't think anyone could dispute that. There's a significant overrepresentation of individuals of color and diverse cultural backgrounds in our system. It's unlikely that risk assessment instruments, even though one of their initial intentions was to reduce that disparity, it's unlikely that that or any other single approach is actually going to be powerful enough to completely eradicate the disparities that we see in our system. But in accordance with our ethical standards and what agencies are putting into place, we certainly should not be exacerbating disparities by using these instruments. There's 2 points I want to make when you're evaluating this stuff and when you're seeing this information in the media. One is that not all risk assessments are created equal, and they're all unfortunately getting painted with the same brush. We have several different types of instruments. The instruments that are really coming under attack that people are most concerned about are these pretrial screening tools or assessment tools, which are designed to help with decisions about pretrial detention. So what youth or what adults are most likely to end up reoffending while they're awaiting trial and therefore may need to be detained. These tools are short. They're almost completely reliant on prior official records of arrest or conviction or whatever. That's very different than the comprehensive risk needs assessment tools that have been well validated over many, many studies that we use to help make decisions about what kinds of services youth need, how much supervision may they need, should they be diverted because they really don't need anything, and so on and so forth. Very different types of instruments, so I want to make that point. The second point, am I close to time, Stephen? Okay. The second point is that there seems to be this misconstrued around what racial bias means. So if men score higher on risk assessment instruments, as they often do on average, does that mean that they're racially biased against men? Men score higher than women on instruments because they have more risk factors and they're more likely to reoffend than women are. Women, given those same risk factors, if they had that same set of characteristics, would be, according to the systematic reviews that have been done, would be as equally likely to reoffend as men. What means a risk assessment is biased is if the scores on the tool mean something different for people of color than they mean for white people. So lastly, there is a piece that we could talk about later that we put out to kind of talk about where the evidence lies with these racial disparities in risk assessment instruments. The problem comes from overly relying on official records in any of our decisions, because that's where the racial disparity is, whether it's arrest or conviction. And we need to educate the decision makers around that and utilize these tools properly, and only utilize tools that have been shown to be valid against cross race. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. So we have a lot of rich material that each of our speakers have given us, and we also have a lot of questions. So what I'd like to do, if I could, is Chris, if you can put up all the speakers on the screen so we can have them all together. If the speakers can open up their video as well, keep their audio muted until you answer a question. So let me start off with a general question first, and then throw it open to some of the questions that the journalists have been providing. That perhaps if each of you just go around the block, could identify one story or maybe two that you think in your topic area that journalists need to be covering next year and haven't been covering well. Maybe start with you, MaryAnn. By the way, Jeannette is no longer with us. She had to leave suddenly for a family issue, so we'll have to do double duty without her. So MaryAnn, let me go to you.
Thanks, Stephen. So one issue to report on in the next year would be racial disparities in juvenile court, and that comes in the form of police treatment, stop and frisk, detention commitment. Focus on it, report on it. There's a million stories about it because it's happening every day.
Thank you. Andrea? And feel free to comment on what you've heard from the other speakers as well, so don't be shy about that.
Sure. I mean, I think something that would really help us from a reporting perspective is following the money. When we talk to people, they often say, well, if there's less than 200 kids incarcerated in a system built for 511, if we're not right sizing, if we're wasting these resources, why aren't we closing these facilities and making more rehabilitative ones? And candidly, these are very good state jobs for the people who work within these facilities. So finding the money who's benefiting from these facilities or these prisons would be really helpful.
So that's a political question, really. And it's a question of what kind of political appetite there is to do that. Do you see that happening?
No, but I think with, as a policy and advocacy person, we have to push from the outside most times. The state wasn't willing to announce the closure of 2 of New Jersey's youth prisons, so we launched our campaign and got that closure announcement. And so we think having reporters kind of follow the money, figure out who's benefiting from these youth prisons on the backs of Black and brown children would put that pressure on the state to take action.
Thank you, Andrea. Leo?
Well, since my focus is emerging adults, I guess I would make
That's
a
a
pitch.
fertile area right now for lots of stories happening.
Yeah, I think that COVID has hit. We think about, certainly vulnerable populations, older populations, et cetera. But one of the biggest impact has actually been on emerging adults, right? They have by highest rates of anxiety and depression. They have highest unemployment rates. Sort of shocking is that we've been keeping tabs of where young people live since the end of the Great Depression. And this is the first time that the highest 52% of emerging adults are back at home, right? This is going to have an enormous impact on this population. And you think about that, and then you think about, wow, now they have an adult conviction. Now what? Right? I mean, it's hard enough to get a job under the best of circumstances, hard enough to live at home. But if your parents are in public housing and you come out of jail, you're not living with them. If you live with them, they're going to be evicted. So I think
COVID kind of complicates that, doesn't it?
Exactly. I think this is kind of a moment in time that would be very interesting to explore. And a lot of things that are happening, things like this election, we don't know exactly what's going to happen this election, but we do know a number of jurisdictions that have legalized, let's say, marijuana. What age do they pick? They pick 21. No one picks 18, right? And there's a reason for that. I think gun control is another issue. People are picking 21. So I think there's just a lot sort of happening. And in the past, I felt subject to it. I'm a lawyer, juvenile justice system, 18 and over. But that is not the reality. That's not the research. It's not good public policy. So I think there could be all sorts of interesting ways of examining that. And they're also the leaders of our protest movements, right? I mean, we think of them as adolescents of pain and difficult. But on the other hand, that bravery, courage to separate, which we had to do to evolve, also sometimes puts them into really important leadership positions.
Thanks. I'll have a COVID and behavior question I'm going to want to pose to all of you, but let me go to Gina first for the second round. Gina, how would you respond to the most interesting story or worthwhile story in your area?
That most youth are low risk and can be diverted without needing anything from us, and that if we use objective methods and validated instruments that have been validated across race, we will do that in a way that should make sure it's being done equivalently by race. So we're not promoting racial disparities and bringing in Black and brown kids deeper into the system.
This is a hard story to write, though. I mean, there are so many different risk assessment algorithms that are being used, and it's hard to know which are viable, which make sense, and which really aren't worth the computer paper they're written on.
The take-home message there, yeah.
Well, I mean, how do you get out them? How do you select?
First of all, you need to know that whether it's got a good research base, and generally that means asking an expert or a researcher, if that's the easiest way to know. But the other way to know is that if the tool is reliant on prior record, official records of arrest, conviction, it doesn't matter what it is, if the tool is mostly reliant on that, you can bet that it's probably going to promote racial disparities. Right. We've already talked about how Black and brown individuals are more likely to get arrested, they're more likely to get convicted, they're more likely to, be apprehended than white kids. And then if we use those kinds of methods and our tools to determine who's likely to go on to commit more offending, we're bringing that racial bias that's in our system into our tools, and we're just continually doing it. So I would pick a tool that allows changes in risk, allows us to monitor changes in risk, informs us about what to do. So what kinds of services does a kid need, and get away from official records. That's what I would do.
Okay, thanks. Let me start going to the questions. I think the best way is to answer them or to ask them in order rather than try to pick and choose. The first one early comes from Cheryl Corley, and this might actually have been answered. It's really towards Jeannette, who's unfortunately not here, but perhaps any of you could answer that. Is that what are the ways that girls are brought into the system, especially, as Jeannette said, that when they're brought in for safety? If any of you want to take that one? And if not, I'll just pose that and pass it on to Jeannette, so she'll answer it later.
So, as much as Gina said that young people are brought in for low risk behaviors, girls are brought in for even lower risk behaviors. Right. So, you do hear a lot about runaway as an issue in terms of the courts wanting to protect young girls. But, they're also brought in for things that boys wouldn't be brought in for. because there is this idea that the system is a good idea, and it's not.
Every data point I've seen shows that the number of girls in the system is increasing. It's all relative, but is that continuing, and why is that? Anybody, MaryAnn, if you want to answer that, or Andrea?
So, I mean, we did a report on this 20 years ago. So the numbers of girls are increasing and have been increasing for a long
they're still
time.
going up. Yeah.
Yeah, they're still going up. And again, it's because it's a misinterpretation of the purpose of this system, right? So if we had better treatment for young girls in communities, they wouldn't be brought to the juvenile court system. And simply because we have no community-based alternatives is not a reason to be bringing girls in. It is not safe to be in the court system. It's not what it's intended for.
Okay, MaryAnn, stay on the screen. I've got a great question here from Judy Ellich. She wants to write about the harms juveniles face with civil rights violations. And she points out that, however, for the residents to care, I guess she means for the audience to care, people she's writing about, there has to be a face. And one way to get that face is to be able to talk with a juvenile and or their families to tell their stories. But how can we do that when confidentiality is such a big part, as it should be, Judy agrees, with juveniles? Many times we cannot even sit in on a hearing, even if we agree not to write about it. And I think pretty much every juvenile justice conference we've had for journalists over the last several years, we've seen that question. It's a constant problem.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting too, because, 50% of courts actually are open, which you can argue about that for lots of different reasons. Let's not go there. 50% of them are open. What we want is to keep young people's faces and names confidential. So we can report on them. We can connect journalists to families and young people. You see it, you use their initials. There are like those animation things that are happening now. So you use depictions of young people instead of their actual faces, and change their names. So we, as we release major reports, have been able to connect reporters to young people and families with a promise of confidentiality. So it's possible. It's not easy. We don't want to expose young people's stories like a high profile case. You can't hide a name if something's already been exposed in a high profile case, but you can certainly, there's thousands of harmful instances that are happening across the country all the time. And our community has really shifted in its thinking about, can media help or hurt? We've seen so much positive reform happen because you all have really brought stories to the public's attention. I mean, look at Grace this summer. She got out because of media.
Andrea, how do you guys handle it in New Jersey?
Well, something that we've been able to do with our organization, because we're not a direct services organization, we're policy work, but we have youth councils. And the way that we do it is that we try, it's young people from the communities most impacted by youth incarceration. Also, we have some members who are formerly incarcerated. And so we're able to kind of, when media reaches out to us, send a member of our youth council, obviously with someone from our communications team as well, so that they're able to share their story in that way. So that's what we do with my organization.
Okay, we have another question from Claire Goforth, but it's more oriented towards Jeannette, who I think is probably the best person to answer that, about the effective intervention and prevention techniques for girls with high ACE indicators, who may be more likely to be incarcerated in youth and beyond. So I might say that for Jeannette, unless Gina, you want to answer that? Okay.
Oh, I would just answer that.
Are you raising your hand for that, or
evidence? Yes. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, yes. So I would say that there has been some research on what works most effectively, what evidence-based interventions work most effectively, and this would be for girls or boys, and that's
right.
DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which is being used by several juvenile justice agencies that I've worked with now, and it's designed specifically for people with trauma history.
Mm-hmm. It's
not, I don't think it's cheap, but I think it's one of the most effective practices we know.
Mm-hmm. We have a provocative question from Harrison Malkin, who says, doesn't this language that we use, impulsive, immature, etc., when we talk about young people, undermine them in some way, undermine the process in some way?
I love that question. Anybody else want to jump in?
Well, he's asking specifically, I think that all of you can answer that one, but he specifically wonders, as he puts it, whether it undermines their agency in a negative way.
So it's all about hot and cold cognition. So even as adults, right? So when you're in a situation of hot cognition, you don't make as effective decisions. And when young people, these situations that they're in as teenagers, they're not making their best decisions. This is exactly the tension with, court decisions. We want to use that content to mitigate, but we certainly don't want to use it to say the young people are more at risk for creating more harmful conduct, right? So when young people, when all of us are in calm, reflective situations, we make better decisions. So their constitutional decision-making, their defense decision-making, should not be limited or diminished because we know under hot cognition situations, they don't have the same engine that adults do.
Right. Andrea, do you want to respond to that? I mean, I'm not sure when we say undermine their agency, I would imagine he's talking about whether they take responsibility for their actions, basically, and whether that is, whether the two things are, contradict each other when we call it impulsive, immature. It doesn't really excuse their actions, but that language might be perceived to.
Sure. I mean, I'd be happy to speak. Gina had her hand up, though, so I'll kick it to her, and then I'm happy to follow behind.
Sure. Gina, over to you.
Just for what it's worth, MaryAnn's response, absolutely wonderful, of course, as always. So to get to the responsibility, I don't think that there's any evidence that youth are less likely to take responsibility for their actions. I think that the issue is that the immaturity is about, as MaryAnn said, they're not great at making decisions in hot and cold situations, but the difference also between adolescents and adults is adolescents get compromised when it comes to making decisions at times where there's a reward present. So they will make the decision to get the reward and not necessarily the responsible decision. Then they'll accept responsibility for their actions, but then it's hard for them to not do that again. And by reward, I mean something exciting, like hanging out with their friends, doing something that's not good for them, drinking. I mean, something exciting. That's what I mean by reward. So they're not great at making decisions when it comes to a reward being there. So I don't think it has to do with accepting responsibility. In fact, kids accept way more responsibility and are more likely to accept responsibility than adults.
I wonder though if this is really an age-related question, because just to pick up on Lael's point earlier, the more we talk about kids over 18 or youth over 18, we are beginning to get into the area of accepting responsibility. And there's a much more of an understanding of right or wrong, even though we know the brain development issues. But that's a problem. That's a complication. But let me, Andrea, you had some things you wanted to say on that?
Sure. So, I think it's also interesting about language shifting because, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, this idea of immaturity, risky, no conscience was used to perpetuate the super predator myth, which we saw never came to pass. And now we're using the same language. We're seeing that come into the Supreme Court decisions that showed that young people are different than adults. Where, to your point, Stephen, you mentioned it briefly, but the brain science is important to understand that the brain is rewiring until age 26 and that they're more prone to risky behavior and decision-making on the fly. And so we're seeing that kind of language shift to show actually that young people should be treated differently because they are still developing, whereas before it was used to support this over-criminalization of Black and brown young people.
Lael, do you want to weigh in on that, on the issue of whether that kind of question changes as the youth begin to, we're talking about emerging adults rather than adolescents?
Yeah, I think everyone has terrific answers, so I'm not sure I'm really adding a huge amount, but the words impulsivity, risk-taking, those are evidence that was presented to the U.S. Supreme Court in a string of cases, starting with challenging the death penalty and life without parole. And the Supreme Court found that youthfulness, immaturity, there's a constitutional significance to that, and that it affects culpability and amenability. And so I think that is one of the reasons, especially when you talk about litigation around emerging adult justice, those are terms. Now, is it terms though that young people would like? My kids would not like me talking to them about that at all, right? And so there is a language issue. There's a way of phrasing it. And I think probably we should all be much more conscious, including me, about that.
Could you define amenability?
Yeah, amenability is, in other words, are you going to change afterwards, right? Are you going to be sort of rehabilitate? Are you going to move on? And one of the things is that when a young person is 15 and has done something maybe really severe, like a murder, right? When they're up, considering whether there should be parole, when they're 25, 35, 45, they are simply not the same person they were when they're 15. I mean, the amount of growth that happens in those years is enormous, right? So they're amenable, they're malleable, they're changing all the time. Well, that doesn't stop at 18th birthday. And that's kind of what emerging adult justice is challenging, is if the youth justice is embracing the idea that young people are different from adults, that they're growing, that they're changing. 18 is a really arbitrary age. And I would argue that the research would say it's probably, any age is somewhat arbitrary, but that one is probably just not a good one to begin with, now that we know what we know.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions back to back for Andrea. First question from April Kelly. And she asked whether, with New Jersey having the highest racial disparities, have you found that the use of force and other civil rights abuses within these youth prisons are also happening at an increased rate? That might also be a question for MaryAnn Scali to answer. And Ronald Burler asks, this might be a question that's better posed to Attorney General Gruhl, but he asks, where does AG Gruhl stand on juvenile justice system compliance, youth diversion programs? Does he run into pushback? And if so, why? That might be the last part of that question might be easier for you to answer, Andrea, but I'll leave you to answer the first one and you can decide if you can answer the second.
Sure. So I will say at the outset, my organization does not focus particularly on conditions. We're a youth prison abolition organization because we don't think you can fix a broken and racist system. So I will say that at the outset. But in terms of conditions, in previous years, New Jersey was having major issues with solitary confinement, where they were just having very arbitrary rules for when they'd be confining young people. And so there was legislation in 2015 that rolled back extensively the use of solitary confinement. So it's only used in extreme situations, obviously under a different name like room restriction or something else, but essentially comes down to solitary confinement. In addition, there was a fall 2019 DOJ report that came out about sexual victimization reported by youth in juvenile facilities from 2018. And the New Jersey Training School, also known as Jamesburg, was listed as one of the top youth prisons for that happening. And so there continues to be issues with conditions within the facility. Something I do want to say about conditions, however, is recently, and it went into effect yesterday, New Jersey was the first in the nation to have a massive release of its adult and incarcerated youth in response to the COVID-19 public health crisis. So about 2,000 adults were released yesterday, and about 50 young people were released from juvenile facilities as well in response to COVID-19. And since, as I mentioned, only 186 youth are incarcerated in New Jersey and about 50 are released, this is another reason why we should close these facilities that will be even more empty on the other side of this. And so the second question, it hasn't been as much a focus of the state to focus on diversionary methods versus youth incarceration. The state this year will spend upwards of $55 million to incarcerate the less than 186 youth, and only $16 million across 21 counties to fund all youth programs from front end to back end to make sure these young people don't end up in youth prisons. And also, even though it was only 16 million, with the COVID-19 budget crisis, that budget was cut by $200,000, so even more. And so that hasn't been a great focus. I was excited a few weeks ago. I was on a panel with Attorney General Greywall, and his organization has said that they're looking at the Station House Adjustments Directive that I mentioned before, which came out in 2005, and is looking to make modifications so there is greater accountability built into that directive. So we're hopeful that there may be some progress, but at least for the time I've been with my organization, front end programs to keep kids out of youth prisons has not been a focus as compared to youth incarceration.
Thank you. MaryAnn, did you want to respond to that, or you want to hold off until?
No, I think Andrea covered it. I don't know the specifics in New Jersey.
Okay, well, let me move. I have a question, a really good question for Lael. I mean, they're all great questions, but this is a really one that's something that I think about a lot in thinking about adult justice. Is Lael, you mentioned Pell Grants. This is from Charlotte West. And she's asking whether you're seeing any states that are pushing efforts for older teens who have completed high school to fill out FAFSA and get financial aid for higher education if they're not in a federal or state facility. Well,
you know, I don't know the particulars of what people are sort of encouraging and doing and what they're not. I do think that there is a growing recognition that education is really a great way to for public safety, right? And so, and as juvenile systems are hanging on to young people for longer, so Washington and Oregon, for example, you have to have committed the crime before you're 18, but they can, right? There's juvenile corrections can go up to 25. Massachusetts where I am, goes up to 21, with voluntary services to 22. You start seeing the juvenile justice system trying to tap into secondary education, higher education, community, colleges, etc. What I have not seen is on the adult side that same emphasis. Now, that doesn't mean that there is, you know, College Behind Bars. I don't know if you've seen this wonderful series on PBS. There are, but overall, when I talk to emerging adults, and we're doing a big study, the Justice Lab, on reentry, people leaving Rikers Island prison in New York, they are not being connected to further education. It's just not happening. Now, is that just that facility? I suspect that is problematic across the country.
So I would think that this is potentially an area that we might hear more about if we have a new administration.
Totally agree. Yeah, good point.
So don't go away. There's another question for you from Judy Ellich. She says, and I'll read it exactly as she writes, is all your examples of reform of the juvenile justice system that deal with age are all based on state laws. And are you concerned for what appears that the U.S. Supreme Court seems to be indicating that it's adverse to additional juvenile system reform when it comes to age and the time spent behind bars? I'm not exactly sure what Judy is referring to, but perhaps you know, Lael.
Yeah, I am concerned. I guess I'm just anxious in general this moment on all fronts. I am concerned. I think, you know, who was on the court when we had a series of cases, those people aren't there anymore, and we have new justices. I would say, though, and I think others in this panel could speak more, but juvenile justice is largely a state issue, right? There's not that many young people that get into the federal system. That doesn't mean the federal system can't have an impact. The Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, for example, is a federal act that does basically bribe states. It says, it dangles a carrot. You'll get federal funds if you collect racial and ethnic data, and you do this, do that. I mean, that's a good thing, but that's bribery. They can't tell a state what to do. And so that gives me some hope in the sense that regardless of what happens on the federal level and who's our president and et cetera, yes, that will have an impact, but things like raise the age, that's going to be done on a state by state level. And so if you start persuading some states to do it, other states will follow along. And that's really what happened when we went up to 18. I know we have 3 state holdouts, but people talk about them as holdouts, right? The pressure is now on for them to join the crowd. So I am concerned, but again, I think for a lot of the reforms and activities that all, you know, the folks on the panel are working so hard on, a lot of that is going to be like New Jersey or Massachusetts. You're going to have an enormous impact at your state level.
Okay, so we have a pair of questions from Cheryl Corley, who's asking it in general. As she said, she doesn't want to start any trouble, but she's wondering if Andrea agrees with Gina's assessment of risk assessment tools. That good ones aren't racially biased when it comes to detaining youth. And then Cheryl has another question regarding raise the age, but I don't know if you guys are really that far apart on the issue, but I'll let each of you, Andrea and Gina, go to it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm definitely in agreement with what Gina said, because I think it comes down to what's good. Because if good, I don't think Gina was saying good is, okay, it works to incarcerate Black and brown youth at disparate levels. It was, what is a risk assessment tool taking into account cultural competencies to really assess the individual child holistically to make sure they receive either the correct placement or the correct treatment and services in their community. And what's interesting is that one of our next projects at the Institute is looking at the racial disparities, like why does New Jersey have the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the nation? And so just this morning, actually, we were talking about looking at risk assessments as causes of that racial disparity. So I wrote Gina's name down right away when she started talking about her risk assessments, because we will be reaching out to you, because that's like a critical piece. Because, for example, in New Jersey, we've now eliminated cash bail. And in doing that, we told at the adult system, and we totally revised the risk assessment tool that will be used for that. We need to do that same thing at the youth justice system. Every time we've tried to ask the state, what does your risk assessment tool look like? Oh, we've been using it forever. It's effective. No, let's see what you have. Let's see what categories you're using, because obviously that is a component of how we're seeing these horrible racial disparities of who's getting treatment in their community and who's ending up within youth prison. So I think Gina and I are definitely aligned.
What did they tell you when you asked them for the full story?
That they say, we've been using these tools, we've been decreasing the numbers, everything's fine. And we say, well, what about these racial disparities? Oh yes, those are definitely concerning. Been here for a while. Hopefully we can do something about that later down the road. But risk assessment is really, I think, that critical piece of how that's ending up where kids are being placed.
Okay, Gina?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And thanks for the question, because it's a great question, because it allows us to clarify. I want to make a very important point, and that is, many of these tools that these states created to make decisions about detention, which is really not supposed to be about detention, it's a decision about whether a youth can be in the community and come back to court, or can be in the community safely without hurting anyone else. And if they can't be, they end up in detention. So most of these tools were put into place, again, well-intentioned. The idea was to be objective and the idea was to reduce racial disparities, but the tools were not good. They were not good. I'm not even going to mince words. They were not validated. They weren't based on any science. They were based on judgments about what people thought made kids a risk to reoffend. And some of those led to some more racial disparity. And so this is why a good risk assessment, exactly what Andrea said, a good risk assessment that tells you what services the youth needs, what are their risk factors where we can intervene and actually potentially change, have an impact. Like, is it something coming from the home? Is it impulsive behavior? Is it anger control issues that may be a result of trauma, history of trauma? That tells us how to intervene in a way that doesn't mean go to detention as the only intervention. And that's what we need, and good, valid tools. So the majority of those tools, not good.
I think it has to be.
You need the good ones in there.
That risk assessment is a tool, and judges are not necessarily obligated to take it. So if you have a judge with a conscience or with the time and the knowledge to think about what he's seeing, then it's just one element of what we would hope would be a web of information, a network of information that he would take into account when he's dealing with the kid.
Absolutely. So that's a point that we would make about implementation, that you would never stake someone's life on an algorithm. Yeah. It's one piece of information, right? And in fact, the tools that I prefer don't have algorithms at all. I want to be clear that not every instrument has an algorithm. So I'm going to send Stephen the paper that we put together. It's 10 pages.
Great, yeah.
That he can send around if people are interested. But
we'll post
the
that.
Other point I think the other important point is that I think we want to educate decision makers, if they don't already know this, about the value of using prior records for Black and brown individuals who live in areas that are highly policed. Those records, if you have prior record and it's a long prior record, that unfortunately means a bit more. If you're a white youth coming from a middle-class neighborhood, it may actually be a predictor of who's likely to continue engaging in bad behavior, but you should not put a lot of weight on that when we're talking about other kids who are from, not neighborhoods that are highly policed.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Another question from Cheryl, and this looks like it's for Lael, largely. She asks, is there any state that is not just raising the juvenile age to 21, but talking about making a category for emerging adults in terms of decisions about their behavior and sentencing up to and including the age of 25? So that's an interesting question. I don't know. Have any of you heard that as a I don't know if it's a legal category or just a sociological category, but Lael, why don't you weigh in on that? Maybe we can ask the others what they think.
Sure. I have two thoughts on that. One is, especially when I first started working on emerging adult justice, I'd always worked in juvenile justice. I guess I graduated, I grew up a little bit and doing emerging adult now. I did sort of think with a clean slate, because really not much had been done yet, what would be the best case scenario? What would you do? And I think part of me felt if you had its own system, right? Because they're not a 12-year-old, but they're also not a 40-year-old. There is this in-between age. And would there be able to have a sort of in-between kind of system? That was shot down very quickly when I looked at some polling and talked to legislators. They hated that idea. Another bureaucracy. Well, man, we can barely deal with the juvenile justice system. And the juvenile justice system's been under attack. There's been also, I can't deal with another system. So I think politically it's not super feasible. I'm open to it, but I haven't seen any state really pursue that. But there is another option. And that is called, unfortunately, there's no one name for this, but generally they're called youthful offender laws. It's what I call a hybrid systems where they include elements of the juvenile system and elements with the adult system. And so Washington, D.C., for example, has a Youth Rehabilitation Act. And what it means is that if you are designated in that age group and you go into the YO track, this hybrid system, certain things can happen, like mandatory minimums do not apply, or judges don't have to follow the same sentencing guidelines. Or at the end of the day, even if you've served 2 years, your record is expunged. There's very little information about those, but states that are now interested in emerging adult justice, if they have a YO provision, some of them stop, like Massachusetts, which is kind of a weird one to mention anyways, but it stops at 18. Some of them don't. Some of them starts at 21. DC is 25. And so Vermont not only raised the age of jurisdiction, but they actually expanded their YO provision. Again, it's a way to stop people from getting transferred completely into the adult system. It's this kind of hanging on to them to some way. So I think there's potential there. And again, they all vary, but for some, that's an adjudication, not a conviction. For some, that's youth services, not adult services. So there are advantages, but yeah, I think that's a work in progress. It's going to be interesting to see.
So thank you, Lael. I think we're just at our scheduled stop time, but since we started about 5 minutes late, I'm just wondering if all of you are willing. We can stay another 5 minutes to answer some more questions. What I'd like to do is go around the block, around the table, the virtual table, as it were, and ask you to think about some closing thoughts. But I also, as I promised, I have one question that has to do with COVID, because when we talk about COVID and its impact on criminal justice and certainly youth justice, we think about kids being infected inside facilities and staff and all the dangers that are associated with the spread of disease. But one thing I haven't seen talked about a lot is the impact of the actual shutdown, the lockdown. We are looking now at a prolonged period, if the scientists are correct, another 6 months or so of lockdown or forced, not necessarily shelter in health, but it's going to be a really longer, impactful period than we thought. And that has to have an effect on kids, whether it's younger kids or it's kids in the emerging age bracket, and an effect, I would imagine, on their behavior. And I wonder whether we should be thinking about that in terms of how we deal with that in the youth justice system. So you can answer that one or others, or make your closing remarks and ignore everything I said. So maybe I'll start with Andrea, and then we'll go to MaryAnn, and close with Lael.
Sure. I think just to answer that question, that's why we're excited on one hand that New Jersey has had that release bill and young people are getting out, but youth prison and youth incarceration in itself is a traumatic experience. And these are already young people who studies have shown that up to 60% of young people who end up in the youth incarceration system have some kind of previous trauma. And so you're already traumatized, you're going into a traumatic experience, you're seeing maybe people, your friends getting sick around you, you're being socially distanced within facilities that are largely empty anyway, you're far removed from your families. In New Jersey during the COVID pandemic, families have not been able to visit. So you're removed very far away from your families, can't contact your families. That's just another tool in the toolkit for why youth prisons should be abolished. And I think just kind of in closing, again, tinkering around the edges with improving conditions within youth prisons is important, but making sure that young people can be in the community as often as possible with treatment and services, and only kept in out-of-home placement in the rare instance that they can't be safely rehabilitated in the community. And in that case, the placement should be within their community, not in a faraway remote facility where families can't visit, is really the next step. And so our hope is that New Jersey and other states in the nation, as we're having this racial reckoning in this Black Lives Matter moment, that we start putting resources and money behind that kind of platitude to make sure that we're actually transforming our youth justice system for our young people.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea. I think that the thrust of this whole series, which is the fourth one we've done, is that, well, we know there's a lot of unfinished business in youth reform, youth justice reform, but we wanted to get people on all of our webinars to think about the next step, really, the next frontier, to go beyond, start breaking the mold a little bit and think about what we might do instead of, as you say, tinkering around the edges. So I'm hoping that each of you can sort of put on your hats and say, what do we really want to see in the youth justice system? And do we want to see a youth justice system at all? Or do we want to call it something else or have something else? So, but maybe MaryAnn, I'll go to you on that, but and Andrea, you could pick up, of course, as well.
All right, thanks, Steve. It's a great question. So I'll talk just about the COVID piece. So I'm not sure if my colleague Amy Boror mentioned this, but NJDC conducted a survey with defenders across the country on what's happening to young people in facilities. And the COVID response is isolation, right? So talk about increasing trauma and harm to young people. And again, just to Andrea's point of getting people out of these facilities because there's no benefit to them. We're going to release the findings from these interviews and surveys in January, but we would love to connect with these reporters so you can look at what's happening where you are to tell those stories. And then secondarily, what do we want to see happen? Well, first, there's no minimum age in many states, right? We've got over 30 states where there's no minimum age of prosecution of children. Well, let's change that, right? Most of the world, it's 14, 13, 12. That should be national. Eliminate all the fines and fees. Like, that's on the table. That should be happening. Young people should not be in the court system by and large. Majority, all the data Jana showed you, 75-80% are there for low-level behavior that all of us conducted, all of us engaged in, and we weren't in the system. Most of us weren't in the system for economy, for race, for other reasons. The young people who are there are being brought in for reasons that we believe are civilly unjust, right? So let's report on what's happening in terms of civil rights violations. Let's transform this system. Let's get the 75% of the children out of it. And then let's defend the hell out of the rest of the kids that are there.
Thank you. That's stimulating. Lael, beyond raising the age up to as late as 25, where else would you go in terms of really radical changes or transformative changes in youth justice?
Yeah, the Justice Lab has sort of a project called Square One. If you could just start again at Square One, right? What would it look like?
Yes.
And I think it's pretty clear none of us would build what we have. I hope that's clear, right? And where would we do? We would invest in communities, right? We'd invest in people. It's about people. And I do think, for just building off of what my fellow panelists have said, is, especially with COVID, it's a huge impact. It's about relationships. It's about connections. It's about engagement, right? And, one of the models that's often used for youth justice is positive youth development, right? That every youth needs these supports and opportunities. And what the justice system does is it closes those doors, sometimes permanently, to those opportunities and supports. And those need to be in the communities. And we have communities that are unequal, right? We've got communities with very little supports and families under terrible duress. I would just say with COVID, I think it's going to heighten the problems. Like, I think we've just taken like a dose of steroids to the problems. young people, it's all about engagement. The level of disengagement that I see with young people right now is enormous, right? The drop-in centers where they hang out, those are closed. Schools, one of my kids has not been back to his high school since last March. He will graduate without ever entering the school building again. He's completely disengaged, right? This online classes is for the birds for an adolescent. And if you have any kind of learning disabilities, you're not getting served, right? You're not with your peers, and that's pro-social peers. You're not with the adults in your life. Nobody can give you a hug when you've had a bed. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And yeah, it affects me. It affects, my age range. But I look at the youth and teenagers and emerging adults are going through this, and the impact is enormous and could have lifelong consequences.
Yeah, Andrea, you didn't get a chance to answer my vision question, so I'll leave you with the last word.
Sure. I mean, our vision's youth prison abolition, transformation of the youth justice system, a fully funded continuum of care in the communities most impacted by youth incarceration. We actually cited the Square One project in our last report, Beyond the Hashtag. So, yep, meaningful investment in building up kids, not prisons for them.
Okay, well, thank you. And we are just now about the end of our fourth panel. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us, for joining us on Zoom, and all of our participants and attendees as well. As I promised, I don't think we have a few questions that were for Jeannette, which obviously I couldn't pose, so I'll send them to Jeannette as well and see if she can answer them. And other than that, we welcome you all back a week from today, November 12th, for our fifth and our final webinar. But thank you all very much for joining us again, and have a great rest of the day, and I guess back to whatever else is going on in the country. Bye-bye.